The following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
They experience like fear, right? Of like, hey, like, what if an AI takes my job? Like, what happens to me from an economic perspective? And my view is that I think with Vana, you have a system where users actually own the AI models that their data creates.
GRTiQ podcast.
Together astronauts floating in a space of time.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Anna Kazlauskas, CEO and co-founder at Vana. A builder at heart who discovered programming through graphing calculators, Anna's journey spans from mining cryptocurrencies in MIT's dorm rooms to pioneering decentralized AI solutions. Her unique background combines computer science and economics, including work at the Federal Reserve, World Bank, and Cello, where she focused on making blockchain accessible on mobile devices. At Vana, Anna is revolutionizing how users own and monetize their data in the AI era, drawing inspiration from her Filipino heritage and passion for creating global opportunities in tech. A testament to her innovative spirit, she built her first startup after automating document processing while working at the World Bank, and now she leads Vana's mission to establish a new paradigm for data ownership in the age of artificial intelligence. I started the conversation with Anna by talking about her upbringing in Montreal, Sweden, and Minnesota, and how her early curiosity led her to take apart appliances and study instruction manuals, shaping her systematic approach to understanding technology.
Yeah, I was born in Montreal, Canada, and then I moved to Sweden. My dad's a professor of biochemistry, so he was on sabbatical and we moved over there, and then moved to Minnesota, where mostly I grew up. Really curious kid. I like to read like instruction manuals for like I would be so excited when we'd get like a new appliance, because that would mean that there would be a new instruction manual for me to read. And then I could take apart the old one. And so, yeah, just kind of builder at heart, got into programming through graphing calculators, just figuring out you could kind of code on those. And then, yeah, sort of dove into the world of modeling data through code. The first real programming language I knew was actually Stata, which is this statistical programming language that mostly economists use. And I came across that because I was working at the Federal Reserve, since I was very, very interested in just currency, like picture of Janet Yellen in my high school bedroom, just obsessed with, the central banks and currency as kind of the foundation of the economy. Those are the early days.
I want to ask you this question about reading the manuals and taking things apart. So after almost 200 episodes here, I've interviewed a lot of founders building in Web3, and I find it pretty common for builders when they were younger, this theme of like taking things apart to understand how they work. And so it seems like you've sort of opened the door that this was something that was true for you, but do you relate to that? Was that something part of your childhood of like trying to figure out how things work by taking them apart?
Totally. Yeah, my dad has a story he'll tell where in kindergarten, they were like teaching us how to make sugar cookies, and they like gave us some recipe. And my dad was asking like, oh, like how much sugar do you put in? And I think maybe we were making them at home. And I was like, well, it depends on like how you want the cookies to taste, which is like a very silly thing, I think, for a kindergartner to say. But I think trying to understand, hey, fundamentally, like what actually is going on? What is the cause and effect? Kind of when you poke one thing, what happens in the system has always been the way that I like to see the world. I think it's like a fun state of existence, right? To just like be curious, try to figure out this like system that we exist in. I think maybe in terms of like how it relates to being a founder, it seems like it's a trend you notice. I think it's often when you have that like systems level understanding, like you can take things apart, then you can also build new systems, right? And you can put things together in a new way.
You said you got started coding quite early. You were working on that calculator, and it sort of sparked your interest Do you remember, and maybe, that calculator's the wrong example, but was there a pivotal moment or experience where the light bulb went off of like, technology is something I'm super interested in. I want to learn more about how this works.
I think it started so early on. Like my dad was a huge Mac enthusiast. And so I would always be excited for when he would get a new computer, because that means I would get the hand-me-down and I would literally sleep with the laptop under my pillow. And just like ever since I was a kid, loved the computer. And early on, I was playing like RuneScape and playing games, and early MySpace, figuring out how to edit the HTML. There was a period where my parents were kind of limiting how much time I could have on the computer. So I figured out if I hid the computer under my brother's bed at night, and then I could go over there and take the computer from over there, I wouldn't find it in my room, and kind of get on it at night. But yeah, just kind of integrate it. It's oddly soothing for me just to be around computers. Just grew up around them. Yeah.
In addition to that, you recently did an interview with Business World. You and your co-founder talked about your background and your Filipino heritage, and talked a little bit about why that's important to you and something you pay attention to as you sort of shape your own career and the types of things you work on. Do you mind exploring a little bit about that heritage and why that's also something that's important to you?
Yeah. So my mom was born in the Philippines. My dad is Lithuanian. So kind of have a whole blend of different cultures. I went back to the Philippines a few years ago and got to see like where my mom was born and where she initially grew up. And it's like a plot of land in the rural Philippines, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like now, because my grandparents took the risk of like taking us to the US and providing us with more opportunity, just like immensely grateful of like, hey, we got access to really good higher education. We got to have like much stronger opportunities and different ambitions that are kind of available to us, but might not otherwise be if like I grew up in the Philippines instead. And I think too, like talent is it's evenly distributed across the world, right? It's like opportunity that's not. And so a lot of what's motivated like me and my co-founder, who's also from the Philippines, is like, how can you create global opportunity for people to get exposure to AI, to this new kind of economic wave that's forming? Yeah, that's kind of some of the foundations from back in the Philippines.
This sounds like a trick question, but it's not. It's a question about sort of how you perceive yourself given this background you have with your folks. And the question is, again, a theme that comes up all the time on the podcast is, do you sort of view yourself as the child of immigrants? And has that been sort of a story about how you frame maybe obligations to opportunity and to your parents and sacrifices? I mean, how have you thought through that?
That's a good question. Not immediately so. Like I would say that's not like the core identity. But I do think that anyone who comes from like a mixed background or is like the child of immigrants learns how to work really hard from an early age, especially on sort of like just, that instinct, especially among like Asian immigrants in my own, is like work hard, like, and I think that's a really good mindset to have. Yeah, I'm grateful for that mindset and have gotten to pick that up. And my Filipino grandparents are super proud of me and I like work hard for them. So I left school and my grandparents really wanted me to finish school because they're kind of like, we didn't take you, we risked a lot coming over to the US and now you drop out of MIT, like come on. And so I actually have kind of graduated on paper and figured out a way to actually get that degree because it was really important to them. And I think too, just worth honoring that.
I love that. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. So something you said just a few minutes ago was that in high school, you interned, I believe, at the Federal Reserve. You had a photo of Janet Yellen up in your room. There's something there. Talk to us about that experience. And I guess if we're thinking in parallel, as a young person, you've got this interest in tech, but now you've clearly got this interest in economics. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So I think that I always like to just kind of model the world and understand like, how does this work as a system? And when I found economics, I found it, I think, through reading The Economist and then reading different economics blogs and kind of understanding how economists see things. And I liked it because I was interested in like pure math. But what was nice about economics is it gave you a really strong application to be able to also have impact in the world and see sort of like, hey, if you do really cool math, that can like help people and that can like come back and actually impact the economy in some way. I think I had seen and learned about Janet Yellen from reading The Economist or something similar. And I was like, whoa, like being chair of the Fed, like that is interesting. And so, yeah, just like ripped to the page out of the magazine, like hung it up and was like, all right, like how do I become chair of the Fed? These days, I've discovered like decentralized currencies and kind of a whole different world. And so the end goal is no longer chair of the Federal Reserve. It's actually like, hey, how do we build a new Federal Reserve for data, right? And how do we build it in a decentralized way as well? But yeah, I think like having that role model early on and then also getting to work at the Federal Reserve, there aren't that many kids like super excited about the Federal Reserve. So I'm really grateful to like the economist there who took me on and let me do some research for him and learn about how the Fed works. They have like in the basement an area where like humans aren't allowed to go, only robots can go there and kind of manage all the money, like move it around. And it's just interesting, right? Yeah, I liked getting to see how the system works, just another way to kind of poke at it and be like, how does this thing work? Like, what's going on here?
Did you have any epiphanies? It was when you were younger, so maybe, the way you think about the world now clearly would be different than somebody who's in high school, but did that inside glimpse to how that all worked shape a little bit of your opinion or perspective on centralized banking and the Fed?
Yeah, absolutely. I was interested in kind of like the history of currency, like how did currency come to be? What does a dollar even mean? I collected currencies from different countries. When my dad would travel, I would have him bring me coins and stuff. So I had kind of a collection of like, oh, actually, like each country has a different currency, right? For as a kid, just really curious about that. I think I also like to look at things where someone might just take it as a given, right? And just assume, oh, that's how it works. Like a dollar is a dollar. And I would always kind of want to go deeper of like, hey, like, what actually is this, right? What does it mean? Like, how did it come to be? Like, what might people assume that is actually not necessarily true? I have like a bag of shredded dollars somewhere where like they like get rid of dollars from circulation and shred them. Usually they're just getting rid of the dollar bill and they replace it directly. But yeah, just hyper curious and interested in like assumptions that people might make about currency that might be true or might be not true, or people might just not be aware of them.
So as you mentioned, you went on to MIT after high school to pursue degrees in computer science and economics. No surprise, given everything we've talked about. Can you talk to us just a little bit about what your vision for your career was at that time by choosing those degrees? And if you're willing, like, is there more that meets the eye here in terms of how economics and computer science might be related to one another?
Yeah. So initially I went in just focused on economics. So I had been interested in kind of like programming and coding, but for me, it was always a tool. And so economics was really the end goal of how can you effectively model the economy and then put different policies in place or other sort of interventions. I was interested in monetary policy to make the economy more successful. Yeah, going into school, the default was like become a professor, right, of economics, like do research, work my way up to one day become chair of the Fed, right? And that was sort of the default. MIT has a really good quantitative economics program and such good economists. Like a lot of them I look up to. David Otter, who I did research for, kind of looks at how do you model the effect of technology on like income inequality and runs different experiments there. My advisor, Bengt Holmstrom, like won the Nobel Prize for contract theory and is really a very kind of like deep thinker from an economics perspective. And I think like the idea that he can just come up with this new way of modeling the world that is super impactful today in business, I think is just so foundational. But then studying economics, I kept on wanting like more and more advanced ways to model data. So I wanted basically to push what was possible with statistical techniques, which is why I started to look at machine learning and AI of kind of like, hey, if we want to model this economy, like, can you actually use AI as a way to do that? And so then started really diving into AI, got to learn from Regina Barzilay, who's at CSAIL, which is MIT's AI lab, like do research in the early days of natural language processing, which today is this whole field of large language models and kind of, hey, what's possible with AI models where they can actually generate text. At the time, you could really just classify text and use it to make kind of simple decisions of, hey, is this related? I was doing some research around, I had a bunch of transcripts from village meetings in India and kind of looking at, hey, are the policies changing people's sentiment around these different institutions? But yeah, just like really cool ways to model data and always trying to push the frontier. And that's when I also came across decentralized currencies, which has become a really important piece of how I think about the world.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, gaps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph. Let's dive into that, and not a very uncommon question. In fact, I think I try to ask it in every interview, but can you take us back to that moment when you first became aware of cryptocurrency and decentralized systems, blockchain, and what those first impressions were? And maybe they're different than what you think now, but can you take us back and tell us about that?
Yeah. So I was a freshman at MIT living in a dorm, and actually one of the students who also lived in my dorm, who's super, super privacy oriented. So I won't share his name, but he's like super hardcore into crypto. And just to give you like a profile of him, this is a guy who lives on Soylent. He has, if you go in his room, he has all these computers, and what he's doing is mining Ethereum, right? And he's like, so he never wears shoes. I think he doesn't have a bank account, which is very impressive in 2015, because you could actually convert, I think, Bitcoin to whatever MIT's cash equivalent was. And then you could just eat in the dorms and in the grocery stores. And so, yeah, this dude, he has no bank account. He does not wear shoes. And I'm like, what? I'm like, this is so cool. Like, this is crazy. Who is this? And so he introduces me to cryptocurrency, and he tells me about kind of like what decentralized currencies are and like how they work. Like, we have, a whiteboard, and he's kind of explaining things. And I am just like fascinated. I'm like, this is insane. Like, I didn't even realize you could make something like this, right? It's basically a central bank, but he's running part of it in his dorm room over there. And so from there, started to really dive in and join the 5-person MIT Bitcoin Club, which was, this guy who doesn't wear shoes and doesn't have a bank account and loves cryptocurrency, and 4 other people who are very similar to that, like super radical. And like, that's totally my vibe. I'm like, yes, like, let's push it to the extreme. Then started going to the MIT Bitcoin Club, joined the super small group, and then also started mining. And so I would go to the loading docks of MIT, which is just their dumpsters where they get rid of stuff, and go collect like GPUs that labs had gotten rid of and set them up to mine. And so, I actually met one of my like really good friends at the dumpsters. Like, we were just like hanging out. And I went back a few months ago when I was at MIT giving a talk, and like ran into some students who were like going and foraging for parts and stuff. And they actually let me borrow their screwdriver and their wire snippers because I wanted to take a motherboard back. But it's such a throwback. I mean, it became like the sport of it, right? Where, I mean, obviously there's not going to be a GPU at the dumpster every day. So like, you need to be going by the loading docks a few times a week. Like, you figure out when the labs actually get rid of stuff. You try to time your visit, like, I don't know, Tuesday night or whatever it is. So higher likelihood of getting a GPU. And then, setting them up to mine. I mean, the labs would get rid of things because they were broken in some way, right? So typically you'd need to find, okay, the GPU works, but the power supply is broken, and sort of piece everything together. Had it set up in a milk crate. My friends thought I was like really crazy in school. Like, I had like all these broken computer parts like scattered throughout my room, and they're like, "What is she like?" They were like kind of loud. And I was like, I'm like I'm like helping to run a distributed central bank. Like, it's this educational project. So that was the beginning. I mean, it was just so much fun, I think, to get to directly participate in the network and really like from the very beginning figure out, hey, what is this thing? What is possible? And I'm really grateful to, like the people who helped me learn about it really early on. I got to meet some amazing like entrepreneurs. David Vorik, who he didn't go to MIT, but had joined the MIT Bitcoin Club, because the MIT Bitcoin Club is kind of very welcome, like anyone can come by. He was the first like entrepreneur I had met, and he had a decentralized storage project that was basically just a hackathon. And he went on to become like Saya, but it was a hackathon project. And I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Like you can start something from scratch and just kind of build it up. And so then I started to like learn more, see that as an option. I think MIT is really comfortable with people. You just do your thing, like everyone just has their own kind of view of the world, way of doing things. And I think it's really good to support that. I lived in a dorm, which they closed down, called Senior House, which I think was like actually really influential to like feeling comfortable in more of a counterculture type movement of like, it's just this crazy place where like, yeah, Anna's mining ETH in her dorm room. Someone else is like, I don't know, writing an opera. Someone else is like proving some math thing on the walls. So yeah, it was a ton of fun there.
When was the moment, and maybe it's happening earlier than I'm sort of postulating here, but when was the moment where it turned away from like being sport and kind of experimenting on something new and had some novel interest maybe in it to something more grounded, like, wow, this is new tech. This is a Web3 type of a thing. Was there a moment where that happened for you?
I almost still see everything as just emerging tech to be explored. There was a moment where I think just from mining, you start to see like, whoa, this is really interesting. Like this is actually real currency that's being created. And so I think that is a moment where it shifts from, yeah, just like a project to like, hey, this is connected across the world. Like I'm like part of this network of miners. I think actually trying to maintain that spirit of almost sport of like, oh, like what can be built is really important in just the process of building and like keeping it fun, staying curious and not getting too like bogged down in the today, and instead being like, okay, like what is the next frontier?
So let's talk about what you did after university. So is it correct that like the first stop out of university was interning at World Bank and kind of having a role there? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So following my sophomore year of school, I decided to go work at the World Bank. I'd worked at a bunch of different banks. So I had been at Federal Reserve over a winter term. I had worked at the European Central Bank. And so the World Bank was interesting to me in that it's not quite a central bank, but it's another sort of important banking institution. And they were doing some interesting research around labor markets, which is a lot of what I had focused on, kind of understanding labor economics and those different dynamics. So yeah, went to DC for the summer, worked at the World Bank. And one of the things that I came across is the interns around me were assigned this like really boring task of sorting documents. And I was like, oh, like you can automate that. Like I saw it and I was like, that's like a classic, that's a machine learning problem. Like you can actually automate that. And so I, was able to kind of build document sorting software, which did this categorizing of documents, right? So you look at a given document and you're like, is this related to the environment? Is this related to labor markets? A lot of organizations in Washington, D.C. were using this to basically do kind of like accounting and stuff like that of like, how much are we spending on different projects of different types? It worked very well. And it was able to kind of like actually save them a lot of time. And I had never worked at a for-profit company or even learned about like I had kind of known a little bit about startups through my friend who started the decentralized storage company, but I didn't really know like how they work, right? And so I was like, okay, like I guess I kind of have this company now and we're like selling like document sorting software. And so, yeah, then I was like flying to DC all the time and like honestly missing class a lot, like my junior fall. And then I got into YC. And so it was like, all right, like I guess I pack up and move to Silicon Valley. Yeah, when I moved out here, I was living in a hacker house with 12 other founders. Most of my friends are still in school, right? Because I was like still midway through undergrad, but I got to kind of live with, I call them almost like my startup older brothers of like this whole crew that I got to learn from. And I think they really like looked out for me, showed me the ropes, helped me understand the world of Silicon Valley, and are now like some of our earliest investors and kind of good friends of mine that I'm super grateful for. I think that hacker house experience is a really great way to kind of get started when you first come to Silicon Valley.
And I want to ask you this question about the state of the art of AI, because you were working on it at university. You went to work at World Bank, came up with your first sort of startup idea, which is related to AI, it's machine learning. When you fast forward from that period of time to present day AI, are you saying, boy, people are making much ado about nothing? We were doing similar things earlier on, and you're just now finding out? Or are you saying, oh, wow, the advancement of the state of the art has taken us to this point. No wonder people are so excited. Like, how are you looking at that?
It is definitely the latter. And that's a really good question. So actually, back then, like 2017 is when the paper Attention is All You Need, which is kind of the foundation of the AI models that power ChatGPT. That paper had just come out. And the question we were always asking is like, hey, today you can use this idea of attention to do a better job analyzing text and kind of categorize documents or whatever it is you want to do. But the big question is like, when can it generate text, right? When is generative AI going to be possible? And I remember talking to like my professor, and she was like, it's like 5 years out at least. And so now like we are, I don't know, 5 to 7 years out, and it works in an incredible way. And so I think that from a technical perspective, it is really incredible how far it's come. And the models are like, yeah, I mean, it's just like little Anna like was looking and was like, oh, I can't wait for that to work. And like now it works. And it's like honestly better than I think some have hoped and dreamed. So really impressive technical milestones that have been achieved within AI. And the early signs of it were there in terms of the research.
So returning to your story then, we're in kind of 2008 period here. You were working at World Bank. You applied some of your university learning with machine learning to a problem they were having, reading documents. You started your first startup, Lambic, if I'm getting the name right there. Do you mind just telling us about that experience, like what you learned about startup land and some of the key lessons that this first experience sort of taught you?
Yeah. So super early on, like I had never worked at a for-profit company, incorporated a for-profit company. And so there was all sorts of stuff where I was like, like, how does this even work? Right. And so I think that what was really valuable about going through YC is getting to be alongside a bunch of other entrepreneurs, right? Like I was 20 years old at the time, just like learning and growing and understand. I remember, I think, they had some events where they were like at a bar and I wasn't 21 yet. And so I like couldn't go. And so I was really like just getting started in there. But I got to meet a bunch of other founders. And I think one of the most valuable things too is getting to see that play out over time, right? Because at the time, right, during the YC batch, there were companies that were like the hottest in the batch. There were companies that were perceived as not doing as well during the batch. And then you play it out over 5 years. I'm like, it literally doesn't matter how hot you are as a YC company in the batch, right? It's actually, I think, often like the underdogs that do really well. And like, I think in our batch, the big winners were like Vanta, which is the kind of like data security SOC 2 company. Replit, Substack was in the batch. And at the time, I mean, all of these ideas were pretty early. Like with Substack, people were like, paid newsletters, like what the heck, right? And now we look back and we're like, oh, like they kind of created this whole new category. Yeah, generally for like any founder looking at doing YC, it's just like a super valuable experience in getting a bunch of training data and kind of understanding. And then, for kind of like building out the document sorting company, I was working with, honestly, like I had chosen the wrong person to work with. And I was like, 20 at the time. And it was like, we're going to need like a business person. And so one of the main criteria I was looking for in that kind of co-founder was like someone who had worked at a company before, which like now, like if you look like that, you need much more than that to kind of be the right co-founder. But early on when you don't know anything, I was like, well, she's worked at one, like she probably knows how to incorporate one too, right? And so I think, honestly, it was just super early, but like super grateful for that experience.
Okay, so sort of returning to that question, but asking it slightly differently because it'll be fun. Your brain, as you've described it thus far, likes to take things apart. You like to read manuals as a young person. You like to figure out how things work. if you sort of apply that lens to startups or entrepreneurship, what's sort of the one observation that you could give to listeners as a form of advice of like, hey, I've done this, I've taken it apart. Don't start, or before you get started, make sure you do this thing. Is there one thing?
At the time, I didn't realize how long-term of a commitment starting a company is, right? Where if you really want to build something that is like generational and has a very large impact on the world, it's probably going to take 5 to 10 years, right? Probably closer to 10, realistically. And so I think that I had almost like stumbled into this document sorting thing, right? And I think as I started to understand, like, hey, the level of commitment involved in like building an organization, it is massive. And so you really want whatever you're building to be like your life's mission, like your life's work, and really be willing to kind of like dedicate a huge chunk of your life, right? I've probably spent 15 to 20% of my existence thinking about how do you get people to own their data, right? And so you want a problem space that you care that deeply about. So yeah, I guess just finding a problem that you're extremely motivated to work on, almost to an irrational point, right? Because I mean, you're willing something into existence. Like it doesn't exist, like it's going to be very hard. And so it really needs to be very worthwhile and kind of motivating for you in order to actually achieve what you're going after.
Well, after Lambic, you joined Cello as an early engineer focused on making blockchain accessible on mobile. Longtime listeners of the podcast know I've featured an interview with Merrick before, another MIT alum on this podcast, and really a thrill to have met Merrick and kind of go through that story. What can you tell us about the backstory here, how you ended up at Cello and why you sort of made that move in that direction?
So I was at this phase where I was kind of figuring out, I was like, okay, like I don't want to commit my life to sorting documents. And so I was like, okay, this is not, but I wasn't sure like, okay, do I start something new? Do I join a project? Do I go back to school? And one of my friends, I was back in Boston, and one of my friends was actually doing some consulting work for Cello super early on. And I was kind of known as like a crypto person. And so he kept asking me these crypto kind of economic questions. And I was like, what are you working on? Like, what is this thing that like, and so then I met Renee and Merrick and just chat. I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting because I'd actually spent some time like in the Ivory Coast explaining crypto to regulators, like from the MIT Bitcoin days, and trying to have people understand crypto and how it can be an alternative to centralized currency. And as part of that, I had met someone from Zimbabwe who showed me a picture of literally Zimbabwe dollars like in a wheelbarrow, right? And I was like, that is crazy. Like you guys definitely need cryptocurrency. And so I think that I saw like a really strong need for crypto and stable payments, especially in emerging markets. So chatting with Renee and Merrick, got like really interested and just started working with them for a month or so in the kind of like early office, which was actually in the Tenderloin. It was like kind of tiny WeWork in the Tenderloin, like a few of us stepped into a room and just loved it. Like felt like I was learning a lot, felt like it was a really strong kind of like really ambitious problem space to go after of like, can you create a stable store of value that works on anyone's phone so that anyone can have a bank account, even with like a low end Android device. And so, yeah, decided to join the team, thought really highly of Renee and Merrick, who are almost like my like entrepreneurial uncles at this point. Have kind of shaped the way. I think Cello is also very mission driven and has attracted a really great group of people. So gotten to learn a lot from them too.
That's definitely something I remember from that interview with Merrick, the mission driven nature of what he was working on at Cello and sort of the vision that was driving him personally. I want to ask you this question about cryptocurrency. You talk about meeting with people in Zimbabwe. You talk about getting mission aligned with Cello and the problem they were sort of working on. In the United States, a lot of the talk around crypto is really related to speculation, an asset class, if you will. Outside of the United States, it's something far different. And I've interviewed a lot of people that sort of give evidence to the fact that it's a currency, it's a hedge against inflation, it's a way out of poverty, it's a way to fund a business, it's a way to sell goods and services. So the question is, do you see that in the work that you've done to this point where the adoption and utility of cryptocurrency outside of the US tells a different story than maybe we're hearing inside the US?
Yeah, I think that crypto offers kind of like a whole new paradigm of building technology, right? And so you can build stable currencies that don't require kind of trust in any single government. You can also build just broadly kind of decentralized systems, right? Where for Vana, it's really about giving users ownership of their data, right? And kind of the non-custodial nature of crypto, where what it means for you to own something is to kind of have it in your non-custodial wallet, right? You have the key that permissions it out. So I think that, yeah, it's still so early in terms of where crypto as an industry is headed. There are lots of early applications that are still kind of finding their footing. And it's crazy because if you look 5 years back, like we've come so far, right? But also it's still super early. So it's kind of important to remember that. And I think the core primitives that crypto introduces really allows for just new kinds of applications, right? With Vana, it's about kind of how do you have these almost like labor unions around data, these kind of data DAOs that can negotiate, they can choose to train AI models. And what's important about these data DAOs is that your data on its own, it's not really valuable unless you combine it with other people's, right? You need to have enough data that you can actually train an AI model. And so I think that, yeah, crypto as a primitive offers many different interesting tools that allow for a new like user-owned internet, user-owned economy.
Okay, so let's then turn our attention to Vana. And if then your first startup, Lambic, came out of an observation or an experience you had at the World Bank, in 2021, you sort of got inspired to launch Vana and went to work on it full time. What was then that catalyst observation or experience you had at that time in your life that sort of fed this idea of maybe I'll try and start up again?
Yeah. So what I had seen from working with AI models really early on is that ultimately data is the main differentiator. Any AI model, it's just data. Like that's what it just comes down to. There's like some training code. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into the process. But in terms of what at its core is this thing, it is something that has captured the patterns that were available in its training data. And so then the question becomes like, okay, in a world where AI is really valuable, which is sort of the trajectory that I think, yeah, I had started to see, like, where are you going to get all that data to train AI models? And how might you be able to use a decentralized system so that everyone controls that all powerful AI model that gets created? And so that's kind of like the early thinking around Vana. Super early on, we were doing kind of like on-chain data labeling, where we're having people label data, kind of earn for their contributions, and really finding ways to just bring many people into having exposure to AI, and also allowing like AI researchers and folks who are training AI models to access data sets that they really need to train. So yeah, that was the early days. I would say honestly, we were a little too early to market where like people were like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, I think that like ChatGPT hadn't happened. There wasn't a broad awareness of even the connection between AI and data. Today, when you talk about data and AI, people are like, oh, like AI learns from data. That didn't exist. Like 3.5 people were like, what are they? What is this thing? Yeah, we were quite early, but I think that we really had like conviction on the space of like, hey, at some point there's going to be a time when data is almost like the new currency or like this new asset class in an AI native world. And so how do we build an economy around that and a system where you can actually interact with data more like a currency than how it works today, where typically data just sits inside of the walled gardens of the different kind of big tech platforms that people use.
So if we spring forward to today, you had that original thesis. You were probably too early, but you got to work on an important problem early. So that's an advantage to you and the team. But as we spring forward to today, can you just sort of reset the vision for Vana, the problem set it's working on, and sort of how it works presently?
Yeah. So pretty much exactly the same vision. And now we have just built it, right? Which is the big difference. It exists and there are real people using it and real builders building on it. Like, yeah, what Vana's going after is like, how do you create a world where users own their data and the value that it creates? That's a little bit abstract, right? So kind of to become even more precise, it's really about almost turning data into an asset class where there's kind of more liquidity. So you can have different people combine their data together to power new kinds of products, specifically AI models. That's what most people think of today. So that's a really important component of Vana. The other piece I'd call out that you get with data ownership is data portability, right? So when you log into an application today with your crypto wallet, all of your funds are there with you. And with Vana, when you log in, like all of your data is there with you too, right? So rather than being in a world where each company holds a copy of your data for you, instead, like you hold that copy and you bring that with you throughout the internet. There are a few projects that really pioneered this. Solid project, which is based out of MIT, started by Tim Berners-Lee, who's like the original creator of the internet, and Urbit were kind of the first to introduce this model. But broadly, it has failed to get adoption, right? And so I think what we've really cracked at Vana is both having kind of the pure federated system where users host their own data, but also being able to tie incentives to it, right? With the Reddit data DAO, they saw like 140,000 users who connected and kind of contributed their data. And you're actually seeing real adoption because Vana allows you to build like a new kind of business, right? It's sort of like a labor union for data is like what I would call a data DAO. And that is basically driving adoption of kind of bringing data onto the platform. And then anyone can access it if they get the permission. So you can train different AI models. You can also just build an application that uses a user's data when they come in. From a technical perspective, Vana is a layer 1 blockchain that is designed to work with private data. But for most people, you don't have to think of it that way, right? So for a builder, it's a way to build a new kind of application with user-owned data. So kind of new way of interacting with data. For users, often actually a user will interact with a product that a builder has built. So they're like, oh, Vana is just what the 23andMe DAO is built on top of. And then for someone who's consuming the data, so like a machine learning researcher or a business, Vana is a way to get data that would typically be stuck inside of a walled garden.
Everything you're describing about how Vana works, and obviously a really important problem was we try to mature AI tech to something that's more useful. Everything you're talking about there sort of makes me feel like the time is now. Like this technology and this problem you're working on must be happening now because you've got this marriage of cryptocurrency and incentives, and then you've got the emergence of AI. So is it serendipitous that these things sort of happen side by side, or do you think these are two tools that smart people brought together to solve important problems for the world? How do you think through that?
It's a very philosophical question, right? Of almost how did the world come to be? I think that the two core technologies are in some ways very ideologically different. Like AI is actually naturally very centralizing, right? Because it requires amassing a huge amount of resources to train models, right? They can cost upwards of $100 million to train today. I think that's probably going to go into a few $billion, which is just insane from the perspective of compute, data, and research, right? So AI, deeply centralizing, right? And then crypto is kind of the polar opposite, right? Which is like, hey, this is naturally a distributed network, naturally a decentralized network. And I think that they work really well together because they actually balance each other out, right? Like where one has a tendency to be more centralized and potentially concentrate power too much, the other has a tendency to almost be too distributed, right? If you think of a DAO where it's like, maybe the stereotype is nothing gets done, right? Like it is actually quite good that they balance each other out. And so, yeah, I think that the timing, it's just right, right? And in terms of what the core driver of that timing is, it's hard to say, right? It's like, would this have happened in 1,000 different iterations of the world? Yeah, deep philosophical questions, but kind of in the current state of the world, like, absolutely. Like they fit together in this really complementary way. And I think they offer a path towards having really powerful kind of super intelligence, right? Where you have an AI model that can produce real economic value, right? I mean, today, like OpenAI does $3.4 billion in revenue, kind of that's growing. But I think that over time, that's just going to grow even more in terms of revenue that comes from AI models. And so the amazing thing that kind of crypto and decentralization offers is rather than having like one all powerful AI model that like rules us all, and I think a lot of people are scared of, we can have an AI model that's controlled by everyone, right? And a healthy ecosystem where different AI models, like as they're used, the users are actually getting paid out. It's even really beautiful kind of from an artistic perspective of like what's been possible with the two technologies.
I had the opportunity to interview during episode 171 on this podcast, Dr. James Hendler, maybe a name you may or may not know, but he worked with Tim Berners-Lee on publishing that very influential paper on the semantic web. And my question is, are some of the things that you're working on, is some of the things that we can do in Web3 decentralized systems, is it like bringing that semantic web vision to life where Web 2 probably couldn't do it or failed to do it?
Yeah, so I'm most familiar with Solid Project, and I think that it actually exactly is where like early on we had said, hey, what could it look like if users own their data, right? What could it look like if a user could, I mean, early on at the MIT Media Lab, there's a hilarious video I'd actually recommend watching where they basically thought every user would carry their data around with them physically. So you would like have like straight up a hard drive and they like style it, right? And you have like all these like nerdy like engineers, like it's like a hard drive strapped to your belt and that's your data. You bring it with you. And I mean, now the world looks totally different, right? In fact, the default is that your data is stored in the cloud on a server that is the company's, not yours. I think that a lot of it is just economic forces at work, right? So there's some incentive to have like driven that centralization. And generally, that's what things tend towards. They tend towards centralization unless you take active steps or kind of, use technology to kind of break things up. So with the aspect of bringing crypto in, I think that crypto has introduced these really powerful incentive systems, right? Where you're able to actually build like a new kind of economy that might not be possible in a centralized paradigm. And so that is what has really unlocked, decentralized AI, kind of the ability for users to bring their data with them and give them a reason to actually aggregate their data together through different data DAOs.
And as, again, someone that's non-technical, I understand that Vana is doing some exceptional things in terms of like getting user data available, train models, and the way it sort of creates value. My question is about like the structuring of that data. As a non-technical person, I'm envisioning just this ocean, endless ocean of data. I see builders trying to build on it, but if it lacks structure, can it work? And I guess I'm hearkening back to that vision for the semantic web a little bit with those standards about the way data should work. How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The ability to kind of like work with data depends on knowing the structure that you're getting, right? So actually each data DAO on Vana defines the structure of their data and is kind of validating, hey, when a user comes in, what is the format in which they're contributing their data, right? So kind of like comments, messages, photos, audio files, that's all defined at the data DAO level. And what that allows for is this known structure that then a machine learning engineer or application builder knows when the data is coming in. That said, I think that as AI models become more and more advanced and as AI agents are doing a lot of the interactions on behalf of the user, you can get more flexible on structure, right? It's actually okay if some of the data is messy. And so I think that we'll see that shift as well.
Clearly, there's going to be listeners listening to this interview who want to get more involved with Vana, figure out what's going on and how can they participate and how can they learn more. Given where you're at in the cycle here of building this, how can listeners get involved and what's like a way to participate?
Yeah. So if you want to dive in really deep and you're a builder, come and build a data DAO. Vana is a permissionless network, so you can kind of get started. If you go into our docs, there is like a 3-step guide to starting a data liquidity pool, which is kind of the more technical term for a data DAO. Essentially, what it's referring to is kind of being able to pool different data. Data DAOs are a subset of data liquidity pools because not every data liquidity pool actually operates as a DAO. Some of them just use a stablecoin or something else. So if you're a builder, dive into the docs.vana.org. If you're a user, a great way to get involved is to try out some of the different data DAOs that are building on the network. And so if you go to our website, vana.org, there are a bunch of different kind of links to the applications that you can try out. And then we'll also be releasing a data hub in the next couple of weeks, actually, where you can kind of easily explore a whole bunch of the different data DAOs, interact with the network. And then if you're a machine learning engineer and you want to train an AI model, I think getting in touch with specific data DAOs, there's also a company called TensorSource, which basically, if you're coming from a Web 2 background and you want to access the data, but maybe not think about any of the Web 3 aspects, they'll make it really easy for you to be able to see that data. Yeah, following us on Twitter @with Vana and kind of checking things out. Those are the different touch points where you can get involved.
And as you may or may not know, a lot of my listeners are enthusiastic about Web3 data and the graph because of the origins of this podcast within the graph ecosystem. A lot of people have been sort of following the growth of that project and meeting builders that kind of use and understand the importance of decentralized indexing and querying layer like the graph. As a non-technical person, and again, a lot of my listeners probably being the same as me, can you help us understand how indexing all that data and I guess ensuring that it comes from a decentralized sources to a project like Vana? I mean, how are you thinking through all of that?
Yeah, that indexing piece is really important, right? How do you allow for data to be discoverable on the network and actually have some structure to it as well? I believe there is, I'm not sure exactly what the status is in terms of kind of the graph and Vana, but I know that there is some kind of discussion, brainstorming happening over there to figure out how best to leverage the graph in order to make data more queryable and kind of more easily available. So excited to see where that goes.
It's weird to me, and maybe you just won't even take the argument, but it's weird to me that in Web3, there still is a debate about how important decentralization is. And I understand the argument from the perspective of the market. Like, do devs really care? Do users really care? But it seems to me odd that builders are still arguing this. Where'd you come in on that? I mean, do you see it as well, that there's a debate about this? And do you have like really strong feelings about like, no, that's a non-negotiable. This thing, the stack and the tech has to be decentralized?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it doesn't have to be decentralized, then you can use a Web2 database, right? So I think that I fall pretty strongly on like the decentralization perspective. I think that often what works well for crypto is you can build in that resiliency. You can also, there are aspects of kind of regulatory arbitrage that come from decentralization. In the case of Vana, personal data is actually highly regulated, right? So a lot of people don't realize you actually legally own your data, right? In the same way that when you park your car in a parking lot, like the parking lot doesn't own your car. When you put your data in a platform, it's still legally yours. So because of that, you can always go to a platform and take your data back. But if Vana were a centralized company, then that wouldn't work, right? So you actually need that decentralization in order to be able to leverage individual data rights to build a system like this and make it possible. That's in Vana specifically, but kind of more broadly, yeah, I guess just sort of a deep belief in decentralization. I guess the properties of decentralization that are important, right? I think you have kind of like sovereignty, like true self-sovereignty and censorship resistance. So I orient towards like more of those properties that you want to achieve. And then like decentralization is one way to get there. For Vana, it is the main way to get there. But I think that there are also technologies that are like self-sovereign and censorship resistant that might not require necessarily a blockchain, but it could be more of a distributed system, like the local large language model communities who are running AI models on their computer, right? They're not using a blockchain, but they have self-sovereignty, they have censorship resistance. And so I always orient towards like, what are the core properties you want? And then how do you use these different tools to get there?
And I want to ask you this question about your approach to learning. So you were successful at university, you're still going to complete that work. You're obviously successful in career. You're working on some very sort of knowledge base. You got to learn a lot to succeed. Are there any mental models or lenses you use when you approach a subject, something that you're trying to learn that might be helpful for listeners or someone like myself that kind of want to have the same appetite in learning that you've accomplished?
Yeah, I think very much by analogy. Like actually often people will come to me and ask like, hey, like, can you figure out what the analogy is for the business they're building of like, oh, it's like, I don't know, Infura for mobile, or whatever the analogy is. So I think that being willing to lean on analogy, even if it's not perfect, just because it's helpful. And then you can think through how is it similar? How is it different? How does it sort of fit? That's the number one thing I'd say.
Yeah, and I've already seen you sort of use that in some of your answers when you were talking about the labor union or you talked about the parking lot. So you've already sort of shown how you use that. I want to ask you this question about motivation then. What motivates you as just a person? Like, I know you're certainly motivated about your startup. You've got this great idea, but is there a drive, a vision you have, something inside you that drives you?
Yeah, I think that there is kind of this very strong conviction around like the need for a user-owned internet, which is like what gets me off in terms of like, okay, how do we make this happen? Like, how do we actually push this forward? I'm generally drawn towards kind of hard technical problems that have very large scale impact if you can make them work. So some of it is like curiosity. Some of it is just, I don't know, it's like innate drive. Like I just really just hard work. Like I just have constantly this energy to put towards something and always want to be pushing something forward. Yeah, I think it comes from this place of like really seeing what could be possible and like being able to see that future and then ensuring that you kind of guide the present towards that. And that's kind of the activity of building. It's like, hey, this is the future we want to get to. And then like, how do we guide the present there?
Are you afraid of failure?
No, it's very, I mean, I think that like it sort of depends. You can be tied to a specific outcome of like, this is what it should look like. But it's kind of interesting where for me, it's sort of like you see the state of the world, you almost know we're going there. And it's just a question of like how you get there as fast as possible. I think there are times where it's like, oh, there's this specific thing and we want it to go this way. But yeah, I mean, you can only kind of control what's in your direct control.
Well, and I only have a few more questions for you before I ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask each guest every week. They're a lot of fun, give us a chance to get to know you a little bit better, and hopefully gives us some ideas of things that we should check out or get more involved with. So first question I want to ask you is about AI. I mean, you're sort of tracking it from university to present. If you project out a little bit, what's the next big thing you're watching for? Is maybe outside of even the work you're doing is just an enthusiast about this tech and what it could mean for the world. Is there a milestone or a mile marker that you're sort of watching for?
Yeah, I think that just in model performance for LLMs, it just keeps getting better and better and really starting to see it be good enough that you can have kind of agent-like behavior where agents are able to kind of operate on their own and guide some of their decision-making. I think that that's going to be a really big milestone. I think audio and video models are getting better and better. They're still kind of clunky, still very expensive to work with. But I think that over the course of a year, that there are going to be kind of massive improvements there. I mean, it's just like honestly so great. Like it's an amazing time to be alive and like get to experience AI progress. Week over week, there's like something that comes out and it's like, wow, this is like so impressive. Yeah, another thing I track pretty closely is it's kind of like model architectures, like what actually, as AI models get better and better, like, are they going to follow like a transformer model or are they going to be like an SSM, these kind of different model architectures? That's more of like a niche technical point I just find interesting. Another thing I track that I think is a big open question in the industry is whether most models are going to be run locally on people's devices. Right? Like, is it going to be kind of what Apple is pushing towards where you have an AI model on your device that can work with your data and a lot of it stays local? Or is it going to be something that is in the cloud? Right? And I think that has a lot of economic implications, right? Like basically how much GPU demand is going to come from AI inference and how much of that, okay, then is going to be, in the cloud or is it going to be local?
And I want to ask you this question, and I think I'm going to fumble through it, so I'll do my best to ask it. But it's this question about the AI market and sort of the types of problems and the types of things Vana's working on and others sort of in that competitive set. And the question is, we know for sure there's a market for AI. And then we've got sort of this decentralized flavor of AI, the types of things that you're working on. And so my question is that existing market sort of resistant to this flavor of decentralized AI that's emerging? Is there a segment of the market that's highly attracted to that? Are you hitting up against that wall? I mean, Help us understand, I guess, the market for decentralized AI and this broader discussion of this amazing rocket ship we're watching with people using and wanting AI.
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about decentralized AI is many of the builders in the space are actually like new to crypto, right? Some of them are AI people, some of them are like engineers, but not sort of crypto people. And I think that if you talk to even like your parents or your grandparents, like the idea of everyone wanting to control AI and kind of like collectively own AI and decentralize AI, that actually really resonates, I think, with a broader user base and demographic than some of the more kind of like DeFi oriented products. So what's been really cool to see, and it's still quite early, I think the general view of the open source AI community is still skeptical of crypto, right? But over time, you're sort of seeing more and more people come over. And one thing that's really facing the AI community today is this kind of data wall where we're actually running out of data to train AI models on. And so, because of that, I think people are more open to different decentralized approaches, right? Including Vana, which allows for data to kind of come out of these walled gardens where usually it would be stuck and then accelerate AI progress forward. And that's one area where the incentives of kind of decentralized AI and user owned technologies are actually very aligned with just AI progress, right? If you want to build better AI, you need more data. Good way to get data is to have users own the AI models that they contribute to. That's this really cool piece where you're not relying just on ideology of telling someone, hey, AI should be decentralized, so use this product because it's more decentralized, but you're actually putting something net new in front of a user that says, hey, here is an AI model that's only possible because you've contributed your data to it and because you've made it better. And so I think that's like one of the really great tailwinds that's helping decentralized AI right now.
You've said in another interview, you've said that AI might take your job, but you'll own that AI model. Can you help us understand that? That's a little bit of a twist on this sort of mainstream fear that AI is going to take people's jobs, but you have a little bit of a optimistic twist there, if I understand it correctly.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I think that as AI gets better and better, I mean, you can imagine, like, I can't wait for AI Anna, like I want 10 AI Annas I can just deploy to kind of go and operate as needed. But what's important is actually having that ownership of that model, right? I think a lot of the time people think of AI and they experience like fear, right? Of like, hey, like, what if an AI takes my job? Like, what happens to me from an economic perspective? And my view is that I think with Vana, you have a system where users actually own the AI models that their data creates, right? So you align incentives much better, right? Then rather than saying, hey, I want to strike AI because I see it against, I want to strike against AI because I see it as competition, you see it as more complementary to you, as kind of a way to scale yourself.
And then finally, Anna, as an expert on AI, somebody working in the space, building really innovative things, maybe a bad question, but I still want to ask it. Which one do you use? I mean, I imagine with all the different things out there in the marketplace, there's some competitive advantage to, I guess I'm familiar with Claude, I'm familiar with ChatGPT. Obviously, there's Gemini. Is there one that you sort of use as maybe you got insight that we could all learn from?
I use Claude by default. I can guide it in the way that I like. And then I have some local models that I run as well. I have a kind of little setups and experiments that I'm running, but my default is Claude.
Well, Anna, now we've reached the point where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are 10 questions I ask every guest. And I do it because, first of all, we want to learn more about you, but I always hope the listeners will learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own lives. So, Anna, are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Yeah.
The GRTiQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
This is the way.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
I think just reading appliance manuals as a way to kind of understand the world and kind of understand step by step how different things work and how people choose to explain things. Yeah, I realized that is like not that interesting of content to dive into, but like, yeah, for me as a kid, just reading some appliance manuals, like pretty interesting.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
One of my favorite things to watch is I'll look for like really old YouTube videos of entrepreneurs and founders giving talks. Like you want things that have like sub 5,000 views, and then you can kind of like watch them evolve as a founder over time. So it's my favorite content to consume via video.
If you'd only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
I would probably choose something relatively neutral to be safe. I mean, maybe I'm being too strategic about the game of like you only get one, but like I'd probably choose some kind of like meditation soundtrack if everything else is going to be taken away. Like I'm like, that's probably the safest bet I would want to save. Yeah.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
Okay, this is kind of counterintuitive, but it's to not listen to other people's advice. And I think that it took me a long time to kind of understand where that comes from. And I think a lot of it is actually just that most people don't have the full context, right? And so advice taken out of context can sometimes be more harmful than if you as a founder had just sort of figured things out from first principles. But yeah, I guess just being very mindful about how you take advice, not as, oh, this is what I should do, but as a data point that you should take in as kind of an input to your end decision.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
I think that realizing that literally everything is just a skill that you can learn, right? Like I think that like even learning how to give talks and how to talk to people or how to be a good friend or a good partner or a good manager. Like I think there are some things where people think of them as innate traits. And there are other things where it's like, oh, it's a technical skill. You can just learn it. Like learning to code. No one says like, oh, I was born bad at coding, right? Whereas sometimes people are like, I'm just not good with people, right? But I think that the thing that I've learned is like literally any skill you can learn. You just have to like sit down and figure it out and be willing to like try and mess it up and then just get better over time. So I think just seeing basically every skill as like something that is learnable.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Sleep is really important. I think just really prioritizing sleep is so critical. And it's hard as a founder, right? I think that there are times when, you've got to kind of like find ways to squeeze out an extra hour. And sometimes that comes out of sleep when absolutely needed. But I think very, very aggressively prioritizing sleep has been super important to just making sure that you've got the right perspective and you're thinking clearly.
Anna, based on your own life experience and observations, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
I think it's just persistence. I think like generally it's basically just like how badly do you want it, right? Like, and I think it just comes out like, okay, if you really, really want something, like if you really want to build towards this world that you want to create and you're going to be like relentless about it, like insanely persistent, then like probably it's going to work at some point. Right. So I would say just like, you should do things that you really, really want to do almost to an irrational extent. Like you should just believe that it is absolutely critical that you do it. If it doesn't happen, it's going to be like a huge failure. Like you really need to make it work. So just like desire and persistence is generally very correlated with success.
And then the final three questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about the future of Web3 is?
I was trying to think of a single word, but I think it's broadly like, as we bring more and more people on chain, right? Like imagine we're able to bring like 1 billion people on chain and then train like better and better AI models with everyone and starting to have people think of Web3, not just as a technology, but kind of more as a new way of having true ownership. And a new way of being able to build kind of like economic primitives or like different kinds of business models where you're actually an owner and a stakeholder in the products that you use.
And the next one, if you're on Twitter or X, whatever people decide to call it, you should be following.
I really like this blog, Marginal Revolution, which Tyler Cohen writes. It's an economics blog. They tweet their posts when they go out. So that's a good one to follow.
And then Anna, the final question, happiest when?
I'm building, just building something like that's, and building takes many different forms, right? It's writing code, it's sort of shipping, it's helping other people ship. But just happiest when I'm building and creating.
The GRTiQ 10.
And I show you how deep the
Anna, what a thrill to interview and welcome you to the GRTiQ podcast. Your story's not only inspiring, but incredibly educational. And it makes me optimistic about the future and what we might see in terms of data and AI. If listeners want to stay in touch with you, follow your work and the things you're working on, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
So on Twitter, you can follow at Anna_Kazlauskas, just Kaz, Kaz, that will find what you need. And then you can find Vana's Twitter at with Vana. That's the kind of, open source protocol. You can also find Open Data Labs, which is the company that's contributing to Vana. And so those are the different Twitter handles.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ.
Podcast.